Hey everybody, Chalkboard History. It's Wednesday, it's warm, it is rainy, and my usual compatriot is, where is he?
Somewhere in the UK. He's across the pond.
God, he's
being better than us.
I know, he's always in love with the British. He was practically crying when the Queen died.
Oh, man.
And I was like, we broke away from that like hundreds of years ago.
On
so
purpose.
Today we're joined by Bella. Bella is... What are you, Bella?
That's a really good question, and I ask myself that a lot, actually, so this kind of feels like a conversation with me.
All right, so what do you do here?
I am an interpreter here. I absolutely love it. I am an interpreter at Ripavilla and Carnton as well, and I do our film content, so I'm usually behind the camera.
Behind the camera. Who's behind the camera today?
Behind the camera is Emily! Hi, Emily!
So we thought it would be fun. I mean, I could spend 20 or 30 minutes just riffing on Joseph not being here, and that I'm going to probably have to fill his position by the time he gets back. But we decided that we were going to talk about why young people don't care about history.
Boo!
Boo, young people. Because it's something that seriously we hear all the time. That young people, they don't care about history, or history isn't taught in schools like it used to be taught, blah, blah, blah. I've heard it all. But in recent years, there's been like this relentless, almost onslaught.
Yeah.
And most of it from the people we hear, guests, is pretty benign, but they clearly are concerned. So before we get into that, we had a staff meeting yesterday, and one of the things that I talked about yesterday was over the weekend, Peter Carmichael passed away, and anybody in the Civil War community who's been in it for a while knew who he was. But one of the things that I always thought that he did really well was he pushed against that narrative about young people not caring about history. And the institute that he was, it was basically his creation, welcomed in young people every summer. And, I think that this is an important topic because 20 or 30 years from now, I'm gone. My whole generation is gone. The civil rights generation is already on its way out. The veterans were gone long ago. So history does belong in the hands of the young. And I don't understand the aversion. So young person who's also, I think a lot of people, I'm sure I told you this when I interviewed you, and I think I've told every female who's worked for the organization, that there are men who will immediately go, well, the girl's going to give us the tour. Right. And so it's like a double-edged sword. There's not only this age thing, there's also, I think, a gender thing going on. Right. So why are you interested in history? And what do you see within your circles in the field of history? Show's yours.
So personally, I became interested in history, honestly, just as a coping mechanism. Like I see the world around me and I don't know what to do with it and what to do in it and how to handle myself. So I look to people like Frida Kahlo on my mug this morning, examples of women who have lived through these ridiculous times in history, right? And I looked to them as an example, and then as I got older, I realized, I love storytelling. And all these are true things, real things that happen to humans, happen to people. So I wanted to be a part of carrying that story forward, because I feel like there's a lot of honor and there's a lot of sanctity in continuing to retell stories, especially to people who haven't heard them before. It's so exciting and so great. So me personally, that's what it was. But I feel like my generation, if I might speak on all of our behalf, are absolutely interested in history, but we're interested in a way that is a lot more fierce and active. And I think that makes people from older generations uncomfortable, which is okay. But, they see a lot of my generation protesting, posting on social media, boycotting things. And I think a lot of people forget that we are not the first generation to do that.
Right.
We are not the first generation to be activists.
Shame on you for expressing your opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I hear this, young people don't care about history, what they really mean is you don't care about history the way I want to tell it. And that's okay. You are entitled to your opinion, but when you let that stop you from learning from people who are just as qualified as you are and know just as much as you do, that's when it becomes an issue, because you might as well just plug your ears and not be here.
So in the field that we work in, which is obviously like, you could call the road the Civil War road, but there's a lot of little intersections to it. And, you know, a major intersection is how slavery is on one side of the war, and then the other side of it are lingering issues with race, but there's politics. There's obviously gender. There's men fighting. There's women at home. You know, there's a lot. There's a lot within the 50 to 100 years that we focus in on all the time. But what is it about the Civil War that interested you, and what do you think? So, speaking for the entire your entire generation, what does the war mean? You know, what does it? How important is it, or how is it viewed? What's the perspective?
Again, on behalf of all of Gen Z, the Civil War is an example of what happens when you do not listen to each other. And, you know, we see for the 50 years preceding the war that there were compromises made, you know, in some attempt to, okay, we'll do one slave state and one free state, and that didn't work, you know. But it's an example of what happens when you allow that two-party system, or that so completely polarized divide, to literally rip your country apart. And by the Civil War, by the 1830s, when you start to hear talk of secession with the Tariff of Abominations, you know, the United States wasn't even 100 years old yet. We are an adolescent country still. And you've got people alive in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, who remember the revolution, whose grandparents remember what that was like. And the young people of that generation were not listening. This is what happened the last time we had a war. This is what we fought for. This is why our country is good. And they allowed this institution of slavery, which is just so morally corrupt, to absolutely just tear them apart. And then we have this horrific war, which, you know, we lost 2% of our population. And in that, we lose this whole generation of young people who would have been the ones to walk forward and say, well, when I was young, we weren't listening to each other. We were fighting over these topics, so this is what happened.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so we lose all of these voices and all these perspectives. So coming at it today, 2024, there's always division in the world. We just have more access to it now because we have social media and a constant obsession with 24/7 news. But coming at it from today, when there are active wars happening that we can follow, that we can see, there is this real pressure to listen, like stop speaking and listen to other people, because this is what happened the last time we did.
Okay, so I have two questions. So I'm thinking about, like, when I grew up, you know, outside of a little town. So I think my graduating class was literally 24 people. And so these were the 24 people that for years I was as close to as anybody. I can't think of a single one of them that at the time ever gave a rip about history.
Right.
Maybe one of them did. And I think he has a greater interest in it all these years later. But I mean, percentage-wise, almost everyone was ambivalent about history. Right. They knew a little bit about it, but they were living their lives and, you know, following their football team or baseball team or whatever. And that was it. History was just something that happened. Mm-hmm. So if you were to look at the 20 or 25 people that you went to school with or close to, what's the percentage?
I mean, I feel like I'm an outlier because literally all of my friends are history majors.
But I mean,
history or philosophy. So
right, but that's more of a later setting.
Later on in college and high school.
Yeah.
Well, these are all people that I met in high school.
So you really ran in a circle of people that were much more interested.
Yes.
Okay, so that was not the answer that I was expecting, but it actually proves the point of this, which is young people in history, is that there is an interest, and I think you hit on the major topic. It's not that they don't care, it's that they don't just look at, for example, the Civil War as this singular thing. It's very interconnected.
Right.
And do you think it's possible that for some people the real issue is they don't want to talk about slavery? They don't want to talk about race?
Yeah. In my experience, and this is something that I would not have anticipated before working here, white people are far more uncomfortable talking about slavery than black people are. Like, I gave a tour to a woman whose ancestors were enslaved here. And she was so like open and gracious, and we had an excellent tour. And she said, well, okay, you know, you white people grew up being told slavery is so bad, so we're never going to talk about it again, and we won't ever do it again. My people grew up being told slavery was so bad, we have to talk about it so that it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. So that's a really beautiful thing to witness as I speak to more diverse people as an interpreter here. But I mean, there's no hard and fast rule for like, is my generation comfortable talking about slavery? Because it just depends on who are your parents, what job did you have in high school, who do you look up to? Like,
so it sounds like there really aren't the differences that certain like demagogues out in, whether it's the political world or the communication world, whatever that is, whether it's cable news or it's, you know, it's popping up in your social media feed. Mm-hmm. I don't think there is a huge difference. I think every generation has looked at the war differently. This is part of the memory discussion and the lenses of war, that if you were born in 1900, you grew up around people who had fought the war. Mm-hmm. Especially in the South, you interacted with people who had once been slaves. But by the time you get to the centennial in the 1960s, all of the people who were alive during the war are gone. Mm-hmm. So now it's like a celebratory time, and it's the middle of civil rights. So the people's perspective on the Civil War at that time, I think, is very different. North, South, West, right. White and black. Then you go through the 80s and the 90s. So you have Roots, you have the Ken Burns series, you have just an astounding amount of scholarship. Historic sites like Rippavilla, Carnton, Carter House have a resurgence. Mm-hmm. And there's that's the world I grew up in. There's like this immense cross-pollination that's unfolding. And then what I think we're living in, I mentioned this to somebody the other day, if you look at the last 10 years, so it's 2024, and if you dialed the clock back to the summer of 2015, okay? That's the summer where everything starts to change, okay? So I'm not going to rattle off the dates, but basically 2014 is the end of the sesquicentennial. Well, actually 2015 is the end of the sesquicentennial. That's the 150th anniversary of the surrender at Appomattox. Since then, we've had murders in Charleston, people killed at a church, Charlottesville, the ongoing debate about Confederate monuments, then 2020, which is a whole hybrid of George Floyd, Confederate monuments, COVID, the election, after the election, and now we're kind of coming out of that. Mm-hmm. And your generation didn't grow up in that time, but you went from being young to being adults. Mm-hmm. That's a transformational time.
Right.
That's like if you're born in 1953 and you're 15 at the height of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, you grew up in that. Mm-hmm. Like, that's your world. And I think that, how do you view like those years from when you're, a teenager to where you are now? How did that world shape you, or your generation?
That's such a good question, because we all tend to say like the pandemic. Something that I have observed in my circle of people, which are mostly creatives, historians, philosophers, if you ask them, how did you get into the field you're working in, or why are you doing XYZ? There is always, the before the pandemic, but then after the pandemic. So it was so formative for people my age who are coming of age in this world that is just appears to be splintering and shattering and exploding all over the place. Because that's what 2020 felt like. You've got all these people who are getting their licenses and graduating high school and, dating and looking at colleges and all of these things that are like young and carefree. But we also have access to social media, so we can see on the front lines what's happening in the world, and it seems so destructive. So the choice becomes, are you going to just surrender and be like, yeah, you know what, you're right, my people don't care about history and the world is falling apart and, all of these things are running rampant and there's nothing I can do about it? Or you go, gosh, well, I'm a young person, I'm coming of age in this period of time for a reason. I can contribute to making sure that these things don't happen again, and that people who are younger than me, and people that are older than me for that matter, can realize why these things were important, why these things were so significant. Like, I wonder if COVID had not happened, all that happened in 2020 hadn't happened when it did for my generation, if we would care this much about being activists.
I think that's an interesting perspective or point of reference to the Civil War generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, that if you were born in between 1840 and 1845, and then the world fell apart for totally different reasons, you were forever impacted by that. Yeah. And I'm sure that I know that many of the survivors asked themselves, what would their lives have been like had there not been a war?
Right.
And actually both sides asked that.
Yeah.
And I think these are the things that I find interesting, because as time rolls on, and I've done this 20 years, and I don't know how much longer I'm going to do this, but there is a new generation coming up. Like we were joking earlier. So I'm talking to you. Joseph's like 30 years old. So he's in Europe doing history stuff.
Yeah.
Emily's behind the camera. Jeff, new guy that we hired, I think is outside the door. He's worked for years in the field, but has come here to work with us. And so half of our staff are young people.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm curious when someone is complaining about young people not caring about history, and they're actually complaining to a young person who works at a historic site. Do they not grasp the irony of that? Like, right in front of them is an example of what they're fussing about.
Right.
And that it's not just exclusively a guy's world anymore, and it's not just exclusively a tactical military detail tour. So, last question. What is the one or two things about the story we tell, that you find the most compelling?
Hattie McGavick, I think about her a lot. Being so young, being, 9 years old when the battle happens. And I was on a tour with Leah the other day. We were talking about Hattie and Winder. And our guide, Leah, challenged the group to think about what Hattie and Winder would have dreamt about for the rest of their life. And first of all, aside from the silence that fell over the room, the just like dead silence of, oh, you're so right, there was also a feeling of relatability. Everybody has had nightmares before. Everybody has lived through things which are so scary that they're gonna live in your subconscious maybe for the rest of your life. So thinking that there were young people, there were kids during the battle that watched this happen, and then they had to live the rest of their life thinking about it. Like, there's no BetterHelp.com. There's no like meditation and journaling and like coloring in the little coloring book. You just have to live the rest of your life like knowing what you know and having seen what you saw, except every other person in the United States is grieving like you are. So there's no like solid group of people that you can go to for support, because everybody's just in it together. So I think about Hattie especially being so young, and then being expected to court somebody, date somebody, get married, have kids. But you have this thing in your brain of, my house was taken over and I watched people get their arms and their legs cut off, and I watched my farm animals be hit with shrapnel, and I watched my parents give everything that they have. And then also knowing I have never experienced anything like that, and God willing I won't, is just so jarring.
So why is the war important? Why is the war important to anybody under 30? Why does it matter?
I think it matters because it teaches us to talk about things that are uncomfortable, and we can see we can relate to the 1830s to the 1850s in a lot of ways, and a lot of the division that happens in the world, especially in the United States. And talking about the Civil War, you can be really intentional, and you can seek yourself out in those stories, and you can seek your world out in those stories. And then you just learn to talk about it, which is just such a helpful skill, especially when you're speaking with a person that you don't agree with, which you do a lot.
That is a question I keep asking because I ask guests that question, who I think are probably in that right age range. It is remarkably revealing to me how different that answer is versus the sort of canned response I think that a lot of people my generation would give, but especially ones older.
Okay.
And they would give that answer, which was often about, well, you know, the war had to be fought, you know, and the country came back together. Mm-hmm. You know, and you know, the country didn't come back together. Not completely.
No.
There were great ruptures and fissures, especially along the lines of race, and what the war even meant to the men who had fought it. Because mm-hmm. there was a group that won the war and a group that lost the war, and they didn't see it the same way. But I see younger people actually digging down deeper into that feel-good story about, well, you know, everybody was brave and heroic, and we reconciled and we rebuilt the country. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In some ways.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, we didn't fight another civil war.
Right.
We didn't do that, but we fought little proxy wars for a long time, mm-hmm. and I find the knowledge that the generations that have come behind me through this, mm-hmm. I joke with people all the time. We would hear things that we probably knew were kind of crap the minute we heard it, but you couldn't disprove it.
Yeah.
You know, you had to actually go to a library or find a book or talk to somebody who knew something. That knowledge is now right there, which is really handy because I enjoy being able to pull something up like that and say, oh, really? No, Black Confederates aren't real.
Right.
It's really a myth. Yeah. And just because you read it on the internet doesn't mean that it's true. So...
well, I guess I would ask that same question of you, like, for you, speaking on behalf of your entire generation, why is the Civil War important? And then, like, from what perspective are you looking at it? Because I'm coming at it from the perspective of an individual, and I feel like your generation, like my dad's generation, is very patriotic. Like, you're thinking on behalf of the nation. Like...
Again, I really believe that people who are genuinely interested in history and choose it as a field are a very narrow group. But history in the United States is a little bit like football and baseball. There's the masses that like it. And just because you like it doesn't mean you actually understand the game. Right. Like, you can be a football fan but not understand what a defensive scheme is. Mm-hmm. And I think that may sound like sort of arrogant, but it's true. I mean, if you're just a fan, you're not actually in the field. And I struggle with that. I see people every day who are basically, they act like they're an expert in the field of history, which means they act like they're a lawyer at other points, and they're the football coach or a foreign policy expert. So they're kind of experts on everything. Mm-hmm. That's a preface to my generation is a mess. My generation was post-civil rights, and I think a lot myself, I knew what the cause of the issue was early on. Mm-hmm. It was very clear that the politics of slavery was the major division. It's what we were taught in school. Right. Now, nobody said, well, there wasn't a chapter in the book called The Confederacy Sucks and everybody in the South was racist.
Right.
But it was clear that slavery was the issue.
What state were you learning all this in?
Minnesota. Right.
Okay.
Which from an educational standpoint is always good to tell people too, because there's no federal standard. So Montana teaches the Civil War different than Tennessee, and Mississippi teaches it different than Maine. Mm-hmm. So there are these different perspectives on the war that come in early on. And I encountered that. Mm-hmm. I encountered people who had clearly been taught that slavery was not the issue. And they were all white. Every single one of them was white. Now, they were not just from the South. Interestingly enough, that had leaked out into a lot of other places. Right. But I can say this. My generation, I believe, was the first one that actually had to confront... I know this. We had to confront race in a post-civil rights society. Mm-hmm. There were debates about whether black men could be quarterbacks. There were debates about whether a black man could even run for president, let alone be president. There were all of these debates that were the later, you know, kind of lines and rivers to cross. Mm-hmm. And I think what our generation did is then we had children who grew up in a truly post-civil rights world. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of proud to say that I think these last 3 generations have been the ones that have embraced the Civil War for what it really was. Mm-hmm. A violent struggle about what the country could be and what it should be, mm-hmm. and about what it should never be. And that doesn't mean that everybody on the one side was bad.
Right.
But this was a war where the two sides were not fighting for the same thing. And I believe that a larger majority of my generation understood that with clarity. Mm-hmm. Because we and I'm talking now about white people mostly,
right,
had themselves been unshackled from making excuses about slavery.
Right.
But it has to start somewhere. And it starts when you actually get to real equality.
Right.
And then real equality builds out in different ways. Mm-hmm. And I saw it. I mean, I saw things that played out that, like the last Super Bowl, both quarterbacks were not white. Nobody said anything.
Right.
That world did not exist in the 1980s and even the 1990s.
Well, it's interesting, and I kind of say this in a like silly anecdotal way, but my grandmother said to me recently, "Sweetheart, when I was your age, I was married and I had one kid and I had one on the way." And I was like, "Grandma, when you were my age, you were just getting used to sharing a bathroom with a black person. Like, the world in which you were becoming an adolescent and the world in which I am becoming an adolescent are so completely different for so many reasons."
Yeah.
Like,
and I've heard that too from people, and they'll be like, "Well," and I fall into that trap too, because sometimes I'll hear someone, usually it's about your age, fussing about something, and I'm like, "Oh, for the love of Pete, you know, I remember when," and then I'm like, "Don't do that." I'm like Homer Simpson, like, no. Don't do that, because that leads into just excuse making.
Right.
Like, well, that's how the world used to be, so that's how it should be today. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, no, we used to not have electricity.
Right.
Or no air conditioning. You know, we used to, as much as I hate that thing sometimes, it's not going away.
Right.
And that's the wonderful thing about history, too, is there's this forward momentum. So it's up to you and all of you who are younger than me to figure out what this means. And I think the only invocation I have for young people is, this is a great country. And that's probably a legitimate fear among some older people, is that maybe young people, you don't have to be patriotic to love the country. You don't have to wrap yourself in the flag and, as I say, be a Toby Keith patriot. Right. You know,
that's a good distinction.
You don't need to be like that to love the country and to understand its core decency, which is why people still want to come here today.
Right.
A lot of people are just leaving crummy places to get here, to be able to, you know, live in relative peace and have a chance that they don't have somewhere else. So that's a good quality too.
Right.
Okay, we have 1 minute. You get the last word.
The last word. Okay. We have to appreciate. You can appreciate America and also critique it. You are not a bad patriot for critiquing your country as long as you are hoping to actively do something to change it. Because otherwise you're just sitting there complaining and moaning.
Yep. That's a great, Yeah.
A great way to do that is to study history. Look at the Holocaust. Look at the Rohingya massacre that's happening right now halfway across the world. Look at the Civil War. Like, learn about people and the way that they live their lives and the way that they did and didn't listen to each other, and take that and then make a difference.
That's a great point, because there is such a difference between dissent and critique and being a schmuck.
Yeah.
Okay? That may not be cool, but dissent and critique, I mean, that's the fabric of the country, to stand up and say, I don't like that, and it should change.
That's how our country was formed.
Heck yeah. All right. Woohoo!
Woo! Eagle. We got to add an eagle sound in here.
And Joseph's over kissing the crown's ring or whatever he's doing over there.
Right.
The crown's ring.
Eating beans on toast.
The ring, eating the beans on. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.